and it was a complete halt with about 4 fire trucks and 2 ambulances, 3 ambulances. But alhamdulillah. So thank you for your patience, and once again I apologize for being late. So inshallah today we are continuing with our story with Ibrahim alayhi salam. So what did we talk about last week? What did we cover? Who was here last week? New crowds? Everybody's new today? Huh? طيب. How does the series work, Sheikh? Series how I continue. So, can somebody remind me what we talked about last week? Dialogue between father and son, and the only covered the dialogue the conversation that Ibrahim alayhi salam had with his father. What's his name? Azar. Type, good, excellent. And when we talked about the ayahs from Surah Maryam, which kind of depicts this beautiful conversation, and we talked about how the conversation started. Ibrahim alayhi salam would say, "Ya abati," right? "Ya abati lima ta'budu ma la yasma'u wa la yubsir wa la yughni 'anka shay'a." And so Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he used that tone, we talked about how he was trying to essentially address the compassionate side of his father, reminding him that I am your son, right? That I am, you're my father, and the endearing terminology is being used to stir those emotions. And Ibrahim alayhi salam posed some questions, more of an intellectual questions, to kind of provoke his father to think about what is he doing, what is he worshipping, right? And we looked at how Ibrahim alayhi salam was trying to give his advice to his father, Azar. And the conversation went on. And today, inshallah, we're going to cover the response of the father of Ibrahim, how he responded, and the polar difference between them, the opposite difference between those responses, how Ibrahim alayhi salam was expressing so much compassion, and in the opposite, the expression of the father of Ibrahim alayhi salam. But once again, as we're talking about this, I want you to remember, although this is the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam and his father, Azar, in reality, this is more of a repeated thing in history. So Ibrahim alayhi salam can be looked at as the personification of a Muslim. And the Azar, his father, is the personification of the disbeliever who has animosity towards Muslims or Islam or the da'wah. Essentially, this is the behavior that's usually depicted by each of those sides most of the time. So in the same surah of Maryam, Surah Maryam, the response of Azar was recorded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So the response of Azar essentially was very short. He said, أراغب أنت عن آلهتي يا إبراهيم لئن لم تنتهي لأرجمنك وهجرني مليا. Right? That's it. That's what his response was. So he said, أراغب أنت عن آلهتي إبراهيم. أراغب, which means, are you not interested? Are you turning away, or you have no desire from my alihati, my gods, ya Ibrahim? Now, when you notice the tone of conversation, the difference between how Ibrahim alayhi salam was addressing his father. He would say, ya abati, right? Now, the father did not respond by saying, ya bunay. He did not say that, right? He said, أراغب أنت عن آلهتي إبراهيم. So he called him by his name, first of all. So he said, have no desire in my gods? Are you turning away from them? Ya Ibrahim, لَإِن لَمْ تَنْتَهِ لَأَرْجُمَنَّكَ. If you don't desist, if you don't stop this, I will stone you. وَهْجُرْنِي مَلِيًّا. Right? وَهْجُرْنِي, which means, avoid or leave me. Right? Stay away from me. مَلِيًّا, which means for a long period of time. For a prolonged period of time. And so, there's 3 points I want to address regarding this entire statement. So the first one is that the father of Ibrahim, right, or Ibrahim alayhi salam, as we mentioned, he was talking to his father in a very compassionate way, right, extremely compassionate way, because this is what he cares about. He cares about guiding his father, and as Muslims, we also care about guiding other individuals to what is best for them in the hereafter and this world, right? This is what we care about. We care about guiding other people. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam does love his father, and he spoke to him in a very gentle way, and he wanted to tell him, right, and advise him. But on the contrary, his father counteracted that with gentleness, right? So the father of Ibrahim was extremely gentle with him and was very polite with him, right? Wallah, you guys are asleep. You guys are asleep or awake? Was his father gentle with Ibrahim? He was, yes. What's your name? Huh? Ibrahim. طيب, there's a second Ibrahim. Where's my Ibrahim? He's running around somewhere. طيب. You guys are all alike. All those Ibrahims, subhanAllah. But inshallah, your future is better. Inshallah, say Ameen. You know, subhanAllah, everyone has a share of their name, right, with characteristics. So I'm hoping, inshallah, like, Ibrahim would be like the Prophet Ibrahim in their qualities, inshallah. Say Ameen. So how did his father respond? Did he respond to his son in kindness? Did he reciprocate the kindness? Or the gentleness? No, right? On the contrary, he responded to him in harshness and strictness. In fact, even a bit of a cold-heartedness. Like he threatened his son. Why? That's a question. Like, why is he threatening his son, first of all? But this is like, this is what we want to look at. How his father responded to Ibrahim alayhi salam with a bit more of like, strictness and cold-heartedness. And like, other than the fact that he didn't call him Ya Bunay, he said Ya Ibrahim, right? Araghibun anta an alihati. So this is like the first thing we can detect from this verse. The second thing is that if you notice, did Azar address any of the questions or any of the points that Ibrahim posed to his father? Did he do any of that? No, he didn't, right? He did not do any of that whatsoever. Like, he did not, even though those are valid questions, right? When somebody's asking, when Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam is asking his father, why are you worshipping, the stars or the idols? Tell me why you're worshiping. Like, as Muslims, if somebody tells us, why do we worship Allah? We should know how to answer this question, by the way. If you don't, then you need to, know the answer of why you're doing this. Okay, and this is another Aqidah class, but generally speaking, as Muslims, we understand why we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We understand why we know that there's only one true deity worthy of worship, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? We know all these things. And so these questions, they require answer. Right? And the way that Ibrahim alayhi salam spoke to his father, and he posed several things in order to kind of stir his intellect, none of these were addressed. Period. In fact, what did he do? He resorted to what? What did Azar do? Let's go review this. أراغب أنت عن آلهتي إبراهيم لئن لم تنتهي لأرجمنك وهجرني مليا. If you don't stop, I will stone you. Okay? And stoning doesn't hurt, right? Does stoning hurt or doesn't hurt? Well, I hope, obviously it does hurt, right? And he said, وَهَجُرْنِي مَلِيًّا, and leave me, right? Avoid me. Keep your distance from me for a long period of time, okay? And so, what did he resort to then? Huh? Threatening, right? He resorted to threatening, okay? This is what he did. In fact, it's like, it's rather than reciprocating evidence with evidence and intellect, discussion with intellect, discussion and engaging in something to know. Instead, the father just immediately resorted to some sort of a violent behavior that includes obviously threatening with violence, but not just that, not just physical, but also an emotional aspect of things. Okay, and so this is what Azar, the father of Ibrahim alayhi salam, did. Right. So obviously he has no answers to the questions that Ibrahim alayhi salam had. Now this is something we have to understand. It is the habit of people who have no strong position of argument or reasons why they're doing things, when they have no reason or no way of reciprocating or engaging in intellectual thought, they always resort to some sort of threat or violence. Constantly. Okay? We see this over and over again. So for example, we all, it's similar to the story of Musa alayhi salam, and we'll get to that inshallah one time. May Allah give us life inshallah for this. The story of Musa alayhi salam and Fir'aun. Right? When Musa alayhi salam presented, when Fir'aun was asking him questions, and Musa alayhi salam started responding and reciprocating, responding to those and giving him answers and showing him some sort of intellectual argument. Fir'aun tried to evade it and resulted to insulting him, right? He's saying, like, am I better, or this person who can't even enunciate his letters? That's a form of insult, direct insult to the person, okay? And then when he proceeded, Fir'aun said, لَإِنِ اتَّخَذْتَ إِلَهًا غَيْرِي, if you take another deity other than me, then I will, what am I going to do? Kill you, essentially. That's it, threat. And this is the behavior, this is the normal behavior of any individual who's actually losing an intellectual argument. And this is constantly throughout history, the behavior of the non-Muslims quite often with the Muslims when they engage in any sort of intellectual discussion. Quite often, they will resort to some sort of character shaming, some sort of insulting, some sort of threatening, some sort of whatever cases. They never directly address the conversation because they don't know how to respond. Because when you have the right religion, the religion of truth, then you are standing on solid grounds with solid evidences. When you are upon the wrong faith or the wrong path, your position is weak. And so your arguments become weak, and you're unable to counteract them. And so they tend to resort to that. And so throughout history, if you look at all the debates or arguments, whether it's with prophets, with the non-Muslims, right? And the people that usually attack the prophets, or even until this modern day, when you discuss these things intellectually, then they will always resort to some sort of accusation, including in fact, like even the modern thing is the whole aspect of Palestine, for example. When you discuss intellectually, telling them with them, this is an occupied territory, this is illegal, they resort to calling you a what? What do they call you? Come on, you guys read the news. What do they call you? Anti-Semite, right? Which in itself is false, by the way, because if you're an Arab, you're a Semite. That's the funny part, right? If this is an Arab talking to them, then they are a Semite. How can they be anti-self? Right? It makes no sense whatsoever. But they will resort to that behavior, essentially, right? And evade the whole conversation and try to spread lies. Essentially, this is what's happening in this situation, right? And this is something we can learn from the conversation that's happening between Azar and Ibrahim alayhi salam. We can understand why they're responding this way, right? And once again, we're not looking at this as a person, but an example, right, of a believer and a non-believer. The conversation sometimes that can go in the direction that is not supposed, like essentially not the direction that we would hope it would go into, right? Obviously, we would hope that the person is actually searching for truth and they would engage in the conversation. And if it's right, they would accept it, right? But the third thing is realizing that sometimes our innate predisposition can be corrupted. Our innate predisposition can be corrupted. What do I mean by this? Over here, Azar had threatened to essentially physically harm his son. Like really physically harm. And he said, abandon me. Is this naturally how fathers or parents behave with children? No, right? We do not think so. They wouldn't usually behave that way. However, in this case, if you notice, this is what Azar did with his son. And this tells us that our innate predisposition can be corrupted. And that corruption happens from when there is falsehood, right, or misconceptions that infiltrate our heart. And what it does, it really corrupts an individual. In this case, this is the father of Azar. He's really holding on to that, false belief that there are other deities that he can worship them, right? He had these misconceptions and false ideologies in his mind that resulted this extreme hatred in his son. Not just that he actually threatened to stone him, right? But in fact, when Ibrahim alayhi salam, when his people dug a trench, right? They didn't do a trench, but they created some sort of like the largest bonfire you can ever see, right? And they wanted to throw Ibrahim in it. His father was participating. Can you imagine this? A father willingly participating in the death of his own child. This tells us that sometimes falsehood, right? What is false will corrupt our nature. Falsehood can corrupt our nature. And so what people have to realize is that we should never take falsehood lightly. Falsehood doesn't just take away from the truth, but it corrupts our own nature. That's how it is. That's what the path of the shaitan is. Right? It's not just doesn't once again move you away from Allah, but it also corrupts the individual's innate predisposition, his fitrah, What be normally like a normal behavior between a father and a child, all of a sudden that changes. Normal behavior between two spouses, all of a sudden that changes. Even ourselves, a lot of times, like usually when you would not accept upon yourself, but if your fitrah is corrupted, you'd have accepted upon yourself, right? And so this is some of the things that it would result into this, and we can look at this, right? That entire affection, the fatherlyhood love that is naturally usually there, is not there anymore. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never had to remind parents to take care of their children for a reason. He was always the opposite. He was always reminding the child to have birr, right? Or have compassion and be good to his parents for a reason. Because you usually don't have to tell parents to take care of your children. That is innate. This is natural in them. But in this case, you can see clearly how that changed, right? Now, when he said, لَإِن لَمْ تَنْتَهِ لَأَرْجُمَنَّكَ وَهَجُرْنِ مَلِيًّا, if you don't stop, I will stone you and leave me for a long time period. Azar threatened him with two types of punishment, right? So the first punishment is more of a physical, immediate punishment, and that is stoning, right? And then the other one is more of an emotional, but a longer period of punishment, and this is separation, essentially. Now, once again, we're looking at the different methodologies that two different individuals would deal with one another, a Muslim and a non-Muslim, right? The people of truth, the people of Islam, always desire what is good for others, right? With compassion, with mercy. And those who are on the false path, they want the other side, right? They threaten with violence. They threaten with death, with insults, with injury, right? This is how it always happens. And so this was the response of Azar to Ibrahim alayhi salam. And it really comes out of zealotry, right, for his gods. It's called in Arabic ta'assub. When you have that unfounded zeal to the point that it blinds you, right, from what is right and what is wrong, this is something we have to be careful about. It's one thing to have zeal towards the truth. This is something that is commended. But to have zeal towards things that are unfounded and not reality, that's completely something else. Now, the response of Ibrahim alayhi salam after that, after his father had threatened him, he said, his response was, قَالَ سَلَامٌ عَلَيْكَ سَأَسْتَغْفِرُ لَكَ رَبِّي إِنَّهُ كَانَ بِي حَفِيًّا. Right? So the response of Ibrahim, even though his father threatened him, his response was very gentle. He said, سَلَامٌ عَلَيْكَ, peace, right, upon you. Which essentially Ibrahim alayhi salam is telling him, I'm not going to reciprocate this. But in fact, you only will find safe haven and safety and peace from my side towards you. Not just that, and I'm also going to ask forgiveness from my Lord to you. وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَكَ رَبِّي إِنَّهُ كَانَ بِي حَفِيًّا. He subhanahu wa ta'ala was ever gracious to me. That was the response of Ibrahim alayhi salam, right? And once again, it's amazing how the interaction is. Like the son is always kind of expressing that compassion, right? Once again, he didn't just say, Assalamu alaikum, I'm leaving, right? Not just that, but no, I will also seek for forgiveness for you, okay? Now, we have to realize that, some people would ask this question, are we allowed to ask for forgiveness for people that we know for sure died upon disbelief, right? We're not, okay? We're not. And they ask, well, in this situation, what about Ibrahim alayhi salam? Okay? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned this in the Quran. And in another verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَلَمَّا تَبَيَّنَ لَهُ أَنَّهُ عَدُوٌ لِلَّهِ تَبَرَّأَ مِنْهُ. When he realized that he was, meaning the father, was an enemy, عَدُوٌ لِلَّهِ, an enemy to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he تَبَرَّأَ مِنْهُ, which means he exonerated himself from him. Right? And even on the Day of Judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not accept that, ask of istighfar from Ibrahim alayhi salam. This is not something that is allowed. And Ibrahim alayhi salam only did it because he had promised his father. But when he promised his father, but when he realized that he was an enemy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he stopped from doing so. Wallahu a'lam. طيب. When Ibrahim alayhi salam said, Inna Rabbi kana bi hafiyya, right? Innahu kana bi hafiyya. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was ever gracious to me. And by the way, like I'm trying to translate this, but al-hafi in the Arabic language has a really deep meaning, right? It means a person who is excessively good to another person, excessively gentle with others. And this is how Ibrahim alayhi salam described Allah towards him. He said, "Innahu kana bi hafiyya," right? Now, what's interesting, by the way, in this methodology Ibrahim was what he's using, he was actually indirectly pointing out to his father the shortcomings of the gods that they worshipped. What do I mean by that? So what he's saying, those gods that you worship, that don't hear and don't see, and cannot protect you or do anything from you, right? How are they going to be gentle towards you? How are they going to be good towards you? While my Lord will never leave me alone, He will always be gentle and excessively good to me, right? So essentially he's indirectly pointing out to the deficiencies of their deities. And so he's telling them, like, these deities that you worship will never ever save you from any difficulty. Right? They will never save you because they're unable to do though. But my Lord, on the other hand, is excessively good to me. He will save me. He will protect me. So worship the one who is able to be good to you and protect you. Essentially, this is what it means, right? Now, once that conversation with Ibrahim realized that his conversation with his father is not going anywhere, including his people, right? That verse in the Quran continues. So Ibrahim alayhi salam said, وَأَعْتَزِلُكُمْ وَمَا تَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ, right? وَأَعْتَزِلُكُمْ وَمَا تَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. أَعْتَزِل, which means I'm gonna separate myself from you and from what you worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So when he realized that his people are not going to listen to him, after he presented to them the logical proofs, okay, the different forms of proofs that he presented, and the argument wasn't going to go anywhere, that he realized that falsehood had infested them for so long, and it's so deeply rooted that nobody's listening to him. He said, I'm going to separate myself from you. And then he said, عَسَى وَأَدْعُوا رَبِّي عَسَى أَلَّا أَكُونَ بِدُعَاءِ رَبِّي شَقِيًّا. And so he said, I'm going to call to my Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَأَدْعُوا رَبِّي, I'm going to call to my Lord. عَسَى أَلَّا أَكُونَ بِدُعَاءِ رَبِّي شَقِيًّا. So when he says, I'm going to invocate, I'm going to pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I expect that I will not be in my invocation to my Lord unhappy or disappointed. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, he's saying, I expect that I will not be disappointed when I make dua to my Lord. So Ibrahim over here, what he's really doing is expressing humbleness too, right? Because as a prophet, he definitely knows that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will support him, because Allah promised his messengers that he will support them and his dua will be accepted. But this is Ibrahim alayhi salam being humble, right? Obviously we know that Ibrahim alayhi salam will never be disappointed or be unhappy with his Lord at all. We know that for sure. But subhanAllah, this is also the way of Ibrahim alayhi salam, once again indirectly poking at their gods, because he's telling them your dua to your lords will make you unhappy because you're not going to find the results that you want, right? You'll be always incontent when you make dua to your false deities. But me, on the other hand, I will never be that way. So why don't you worship the one that you'll always be pleased when you make dua to, essentially, right? So I'm pointing at these things because, subhanAllah, these are inner meanings that sometimes we miss when we're talking about these discussions. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, even when he's telling them, I'm going to leave you, I'm going to do these things, he's kind of sending them messages, right? That if you continue on this path, right, they're never going to respond to you. If you continue making dua to them, they'll never respond. So why don't you follow and make dua and worship the one that has all these abilities? Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewarded Ibrahim alayhi salam, and so this is a continuation of this verse. فَلَمَّا اعْتَزَلَهُمْ وَمَا يَعْبُدُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ وَهَبْنَا لَهُ إِسْحَاقَ وَيَعْقُوبَ وَكُلًّا جَعَلْنَا نَبِيًّا. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said when He left, talking about Ibrahim, when He left them and those that they worshipped other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gave him Ishaq and Yaqub. He gave him Ishaq and Yaqub. وَكُلًّا جَعَلْنَا نَبِيًّا. And both of them He made, subhanahu wa ta'ala, He made them as prophets. So Ibrahim alayhi salam was hoping that one person or a few people become Muslims, but when he left them for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by the permission of Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewarded him with something even better. He gave him 2 prophets in his lineage, right? 2 prophets, and from them, right, came multiple other prophets, lineages of what later on became Bani Israel, right? And majority of the prophets that came later on were from that lineage, from Ishaq and Yaqub alayhim salam. وَوَهَبْنَا لَهُم مِّن رَحْمَتِنَا وَجَعَلْنَا لَهُمْ لِسَانَ صِدْقٍ عَلِيًّا. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and we gave them our mercy and we made for them a mention, a mention of high honor, which means the reputation was of high standards. The caller to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? When Ibrahim alayhi salam, even in his, when he left his people behind, he left them in gentleness. And if you notice at this entire behavior, this entire conversation, once again, of Ibrahim, you're going to notice that he's doing this with extreme mercy, and his entire intent, his entire desire was to guide his people and to guide his father. He was filled of mercy. And similarly, the one who calls to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what should really be overcoming that individual is that love to guide others, right, to the straight path. Ibrahim alayhi salam never got agitated. Ibrahim alayhi salam never got moved or angry, because his intention was to guide people to the straight path. So for him, it didn't bother him if people were insulting him or not. That was not going to take away from his cause, right? He never had personal gains from this. His entire purpose was to guide others. And if people do da'wah in this way, it's going to become much easier for them to always keep their cool when they're personally attacked, right? To always realize, I'm doing this for a greater cause. I'm not gaining benefit from this. It's not for my sake, but I'm doing it out of mercy and for the sake of others, to try to save them, right? I'll give you an example, right? And this just kind of obviously the different reactions are different, but just to understand the compassion and just the interest of why when we do certain things, when you see your own child, for example, trying to play with the electric socket, trying to put something in there, right? It is our intuitive responses to do what? To try to save them, stop them, right? I hope this is all your responses, by the way. If your kids are going to be playing in the socket, please stop them, okay? Don't tell them, let them learn their lesson, okay? They'll be zapped. It's going to be painful. So our inclination is we want to save them, okay, from an imminent danger that we see. Now, once you try to stop that child when they're young, what are they going to do? They're going to turn around and say, thank you, Baba, or thank you, Mama? Is that what they're going to do? No, what are they going to do? Not just cry, they might do something else. No, they're not just going to do it. They're probably going to yell at you, right? I hate you. You never let me do anything fun, right? All those accusations start happening, right? And in fact, they might start hitting you, and they might start doing something, because all they see is what? What are they seeing from their perspective? You're stopping their enjoyment, okay? But that enjoyment from a higher level we see is going to lead to what? Harm. Good, excellent, okay? Now, when they respond to us that way, essentially, when they're yelling, right, and they're crying, and I hate you, and you never let me do anything good, and all these accusations, and how is your response to them? I hope it's not throwing them out the window, right? What is most likely, I'm hoping you'd be calm, right? Because you're doing this out of love and affection for them, and you understand their response, why they're doing this. But their accusation that you don't love me and you're not doing, you always stop me and prevent me, you understand all that is false, right? And so you don't let it anger you until they calm down and you have that discussion with them, right? I'm just trying to bring a closer like in a relationship, when a person is calling others to Islam, it's with that mentality. You're trying to save them from danger. You're trying to save them from eternal punishment. This is why we're doing this, right? We're trying to save people's lives in this world and the hereafter. And so even if they accuse us and they insult us, we're able to brush that aside if this is our focus. Wallahu alam. And so this is a lesson we can learn from that whole discussion of Ibrahim alayhi salam with his father Azar, with that, including that whole conversation, that discussion. طيب. Prophets usually, when they make da'wah, yes, they do it da'wah first to their immediate families. In this case, it was Ibrahim, he was doing da'wah to his father. And then he'll do da'wah to his greater community. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, didn't do anything different. He also tried to make da'wah to his community, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala presented three different discussions in the Quran, right? Three different discussions that Ibrahim alayhi salam with disbelievers. The first one we just talked about, which is the conversation with his father. The second one is a conversation with his people. And the third conversation was with Namrud, the king. Right? And all three conversations were reported in the Quran. So let's take the second conversation that Ibrahim alayhi salam had, and it was with his people. Right? The conversation he had with people. And this was reported in Surah Al-An'am. And it's quite an interesting conversation. And many people sometimes misunderstand this conversation. All right? Now, once again, when we talked about Ibrahim alayhi salam, we said the stories of the Prophet quite often sometimes, when it's reported in the Quran, it can address their childhood, their youth, and when they're prophets. Ibrahim alayhi salam, there was never discussion about his childhood or his youth. It was always a discussion when he was a prophet. So everything that happens in the Quran, all these stories are when he was a prophet. His age? No. Wallahu a'lam. So this surah, this conversation is in Surah Al-An'am. And if I'm not mistaken, it's verse number 75. It starts from verse number 75. If somebody want to help with the translation, that'd be great. Translation? Can you pull out the translation? Help me. Huh? Surah Al-An'am, verse number 75. We're going to start from there. So I'm going to read the verse, right? Inshallah, and then we'll take it part by part, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَكَذَلِكَ نُرِي إِبْرَاهِيمَ مَلَكُوتَ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَلِيَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُوقِنِينَ فَلَمَّا جَنَّ عَلَيْهِ اللَّيْلُ رَأَى كَوْكَبًا قال هذا ربي فلما أفل قال لا أحب الآفلين فلما رأى القمر بازغا قال هذا ربي فلما أفل قال لئن لم يهدني ربي لأكونن من القوم الظالمين من القوم الضالين فلما رأى الشمس بازغة قال هذا ربي هذا أكبر فلما رأى الشمس بازغة قال هذا ربي فلما أفلت قال لئن لم قال فلما أفلت قال يا قوم إني بريء right قال يا قوم إني بريء مما تشركون إني وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين right وحاجه قومه قال أتحاجوني في الله وقد هدان ولا أخاف ما تشركون به إلا أن يشاء ربي شيئا وسع ربي كل شيء علما أفلا تتذكرون طيب وكيف أخاف ما أشركتم ولا تخافون أنكم أشركتم بالله ما لم ينزل به عليكم سلطانا فأي الفريقين he's talking about which kind of groups وأي الفريقين أحق بالأمن إن كنتم تعلمون الذين آمنوا ولم يلبسوا إيمانهم بظلم أولئك لهم الأمن وهم مهتدون. This is up to, until what verse, Sheikh? Until 83? طيب, we'll stop there and I might fit in a couple of verses later on. طيب, so Ibrahim alayhi salam, this is the conversation, right? Actually, the following verse is what? وَتِلْكَ حُجَّتُنَا. Is that right? The following verse, وَتِلْكَ حُجَّتُنَا أَتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ عَلَى قَوْمِهِ نَرْفَعُ دَرَجَاتٍ مَنْ نَشَاءُ إِنَّ رَبَّكَ حَكِيمٌ عَلِيمٌ. So, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, is referring in these verses, and I'm going to go through the imagery of what happened. Now, we know that the people of Ibrahim alayhi salam, they worship idols. Now, part of their worship was they also worshiped the stars, and they would create idols in the form of those different stars, whether it's the stars we see at night, or the moon, or the sun. just things in the constellations that they would create images of to worship it. So Ibrahim alayhi salam went out one time with them. Right? He went out with them one time during the night. It's not to worship anything, right? But he went out in an outing during the night and he engaged in this conversation. Now, I want you to remember this conversation happened while Prophet Ibrahim was a prophet. Now, I'm saying this because many people have the misconception that this was Ibrahim alayhi salam reflecting, and through his logic, he was able to figure out that there is one God and he's going to worship that one God. That is not what happened, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the verse that I recited, He said, وَتِلْكَ حُجَّتُنَا آتَيْنَاهَا إِبْرَاهِيم. That this is our evidence, our clear evidence that we gave Ibrahim ala qawmih, upon his people. So this is revelation. So Ibrahim engaged in them in another interesting intellectual conversation. So when he went out with them at night and he knows that they worship the stars, the constellations, he started posing and asking questions and pointing out to qualities that are not befitting of a God. So the God that we worship has to have specific qualities and attributes that make him a God. Is that understood? Does everyone understand this? Yes? Type excellent. So the first thing Ibrahim alayhi salam saw was a very shining star. Right? فَلَمَّا جَنَّ عَلَيْهِ اللَّيْلَ رَأَى كَوْكَبًا. And so the translation is that when the night came, right? فَلَمَّا جَنَّ عَلَيْهِ اللَّيْلِ, Jannah, which means the night kind of came in, concealed, and then it came in. رَأَى كَوْكَبًا, he saw a star. And perhaps it was the brightest star. And the first thing he said to them, he said, هَذَا رَبِّي. He said, this is my Lord. Now once again, is Ibrahim really saying that this is my Lord? You have to remember, the consensus of the scholars is that the prophets were protected from worshipping anything other than Allah their entire life, even before they became prophets. They were protected from this. كان عندهم عصمة, they're معصومين. Okay? They were infallible in this aspect. They were protected. So Ibrahim ﷺ never worshipped anything other than Allah. But this is something that's called, when you're arguing, when you're having an argumentation, it's called a tanazzul fi niqash. Tanazzul, which means he said, I'll concede in this aspect, but let's see how it goes. Essentially, he's saying, I'll assume you're right for a second. Let's see what this leads to, essentially. So when he saw the star, he said, هَذَا رَبِّي. Right? He said, this is my Lord. However, what happened to that star is that it afal, which means it disappeared. Okay? He said, لا أحب الآفلين. I don't like the things that disappear. So essentially he's saying this cannot be a God. Why? And by the way, Ibn Ashur kind of mentioned this in his tafsir. He said, he went out, like Ibrahim alayhi salam, he went out with his people. He did not go out alone, so that he would teach them how to al-istidlal, right? How to find the evidences to identify the true attributes of a God that deserves to be worshipped, right? What is the true attributes that are deserving of a God to be worshipped? And so when he asked them, right, he said, this is the first thing he mentioned, right? He said, being a prophet, obviously, he's seeing revelation. This is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He pointed out this from them. He said that this star disappears. So it's there and it goes. Okay? Now, he said, لا أحب الآفلين. I don't love them. What does love have to do with who you worship in this case? Or who the true God is? Does your affection have to do with what the true God is? No. Does your affection dictate who the true God is? No, it doesn't. So why is Ibrahim putting this in a sentence in the first place? Because essentially, the people of falsehood tend to worship based on their desires, their love, right? So he's kind of pointing that in there. Now, the other thing is, when Ibrahim alayhi salam first pointed out to the star, right? He pointed out that it left. Okay? Now, when it disappears, a God that disappears, should a God disappear in the first place? Or should they always be present? They always be present, right? So this is essentially what he was pointing out to them, right? But he also said, okay, I'm going to use the linguistic accent. He said, هذا ربي, right? This is my Lord. He means he's saying this is my only Lord. That's it. Okay, this is it. This is it. This is my only Lord. Because he's pointing out there can only be one true Lord. Now, when that moved away, when it disappeared, okay, when it's gone, something that is a true God should never be gone at all. Because if they're gone and not present, how are they going to be able to respond to the dua, run everything, regulate everything, and all these things? So Ibrahim alayhi salam just said, I don't like, he pointed out that it disappears, but he also said, I don't like something. He's pointing out the whole aspect of emotions and hawa and desire, which is not how we do things. But then he did something interesting. He moved from the star to the moon, right? So, other than the fact that he said, I don't like my Lord to be unpresent, he has to be always present, he pointed out next thing too is to the moon, when it first came out, right? Because when the moon first comes out, it's the shiniest, essentially, right? It is almost like the big, it might have been a full moon. And so he said, هذا ربي, right? فلما رأى القمر, like, when it comes out, it's the strongest. So he said, this is my Lord. So he moved from something small to something bigger, okay? Now he's pointing out to, is it the size that dictates what your Lord is? Right? Are we judging by size, for example? And so he moved from the star to the moon. Because if you decide by the size, then obviously the first one would be wrong. So why are you even worshiping the stars? He's telling them, essentially, like, okay, if the stars are smaller, this is bigger, why are you worshiping the smaller? You should not be even worshiping the stars. Let's worship the moon. Okay? So he's trying to logically kind of move them from one station to the next. Type. When he came to the moon, what happened to the moon? It went, right? And so the same thing, right? And then he said, if my God does not guide me, I will be from those who are led astray. And then he saw the sun. Okay? He saw the sun. فَلَمَّا رَأَى الشَّمْسَ, and he described it. How he described it? بَازِغَةً. Right? بَازِغَةً, which means it's coming out. It's very strong light. So now it's something that is bigger. He said, هَذَا رَبِّي هَذَا أَكْبَرُ. Wow, look at that. This is larger. It's even brighter. The first two, it was smaller, not as bright. The moon is brighter, bigger. But now this is even bigger, right? This is brighter. This must be the true God. So essentially, he moved them. He told them essentially, systematically, you guys worship the stars? Wait, you can't really worship them, right? It must be the moon, it's bigger. And then he said, wait a second, there's something that is bigger. This also goes, it disappears, it doesn't have strong light. It must be the moon. So essentially he told them all these two ones must be false, then it must be the sun, okay? And then after the sun set, what happened? The same thing, right? It is gone, right? Something that can be shaded away with something else indicates that it doesn't, something is overpowering it, essentially. But something that does never be present all the time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be there all the time. And so once this happened, he told them, Ya qawmi, inni bari'um mimma tushrikun. I'm innocent of what you associate. Inni wajjahtu wajhiya lilladhi fatara as-samawati wal-arda hanifa wa ma ana min al-mushrikeen. I turn my face to the one who has created all this. So logically, these things that are moving, they have to be created. So he said, I'm worshiping the one that created all these things. So it cannot be the sun, it cannot be the moon, it cannot be the stars. Okay? So your criteria or trying to define what is your Lord is messed up. It's not through your desires, it's not through size, it's not through brightness. Then what is the reality? It's an entity that creates everything. Right? It's the entity that created all things that is always present, that answers our call. And so he said, I am directing my face towards that. وَمَا أَنَا مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. Right? And so essentially he's telling them, how do you worship something that actually moves from its place, right? That ceases to exist at one point and exists at another point, right? That goes from the east to the west. These are attributes of a creation, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have the attributes of a creation. Now, there is people, like, accept. They said no. وَحَاجَّهُ قَوْمُ. Right? So his people started debating, providing evidences. And so he said, أَتُحَاجُّونِي فِي اللَّهِ وَقَدْ هَدَانِ. Are you arguing with me, trying to lead, like, and tell me that I am wrong when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had guided me? Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided me. So why are you trying to take me away from this? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ رُشْدَهُ مِنْ قَبْلِ وَكُنَّا بِهِ عَالِمِينَ. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in a separate verse, He said, like, this is our conclusive argument which we gave to Ibrahim alayhi salam against his people, and we raise, we raised by degrees whom we will. Indeed, your Lord is wise and all-knowing. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described Ibrahim. He said, وَآتَيْنَاهُ رُشْدَهُ مِنْ قَبْلِ. We gave him his rujd. Rujd is a level of wisdom. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described him as a level of wisdom, which means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that He prepared Ibrahim to be able to debate and engage with his people. He prepared Ibrahim with the correct forms of arguments that he can engage with his people. And this is really important because whenever we are engaging with non-Muslims and trying to call them to Islam, we have to understand that they will respond with misconceptions. They will respond with things that are false. Things that can sometimes take us away ourselves from the true path if we're not prepared. This is why it's important that when we engage in any sort of debate with non-Muslims, that we have that wisdom with us. We have been prepared. We prepare ourselves adequately with the correct information, that we're well rooted and understand the different arguments that were even present in the Quran. By the way, many of the arguments that people try to present these days, they were shown in the Quran, and our responses are present in the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. We just have to learn them. Right? And this is a lesson for us from this entire conversation, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prepared Ibrahim to engage in that debate. And so we also need to prepare ourselves, but also prepare our future generations with the right knowledge that they need, so that they will be able to engage in those conversations without they themselves being shaken in their faith. That's really important, without themselves shaken. A lot of the times people, when they're not equipped and they hear some of those arguments, it does affect their iman. It shakes them a little bit. And that's a disaster, right? When your iman is shaken, then something is wrong. It can lead to a path that is, is unfortunate to an individual at the end. And so, Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he was prepared for that, and they were threatening him and telling him all these things, he just said, وَكَيْفَ أَخَافُ مَا أَشْرَكْتُمْ وَلَا تَخَافُونَ أَنَّكُمْ أَشْرَكْتُمْ بِاللَّهِ. How should I fear what you are associating and you're not afraid of Allah? Because Ibrahim is telling them, these are false gods. You can threaten me with these gods as much as you want. I'm not going to be afraid of them. And yet, how are you not afraid of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Right? Especially that you associated with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala something that He did not reveal to you or bring evidence for. You have no evidence for this. Which of the two groups has more right to feel safety? Ibrahim or the disbelievers? Obviously Ibrahim, right? On the Day of Judgment, who should feel that they're more safe? The believers or the disbelievers? Obviously the believers, right? That's that entire conversation that Ibrahim alayhi salam had with his father, but also had with his people. Now we understand that there's still a bit of a moral conversation. When they did not accept that argument, he even went further later on and did something with their idols to even point out to them, and they realized it, but then they still insisted, right? And we're going to continue that inshallah. What's next week? Not next week, because I'm not going to be here next week inshallah. Somebody else will be giving the halaqah on Friday, so we still have a halaqah, but we're going to inshallah continue the stories of the prophets from the Quran. We continue the story of Ibrahim inshallah once I get back, which is about in 2 weeks from now, actually on the 26th. So, but there is going to be always inshallah, like in the next coming weeks, there will still be a Friday halaqah inshallah with chai at the back. Our first guest will be Sheikh Muhammad Sha'lan, and the following guest will be Sheikh Khalil. Right, inshallah, they're going to be giving their talks. Inshallah, beneficial topics too, especially the coming of the month of Muharram and Ashura. I'm sure there's going to be discussion about this, inshallah, something that will benefit everybody. So I'll stop here, inshallah, giving 15 minutes or 20 minutes for if you want to go get some chai And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. Yes, Sheikh. It's more of no. It's not a name or an attribute, but it's a quality essentially, right? Essentially, can it be hafiya? He's with me, right? Ever good. He's with me doing things. So he's explaining how Allah Subhanahu wa Taala is dealing with him. Make sense? Any other questions? جزاكم الله خير سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Yes, one late question. Star, moon, sun. Because when first sunset happens, right, the first thing you usually see is the stars. Usually, most of the time. But then the moon. Well, in size too, brightness size. He logically moved from one to the other on purpose, right? Because he's debating. Now, once again, some people want to argue, like I heard this argument. They're saying that Ibrahim alayhi salam found Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through logic. Logic can lead us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? It is true, but logic can lead us to the existence of a creator, one creator. It could, right? But for Ibrahim alayhi salam, this was not the case. He was a prophet, right? He was a prophet at that time. والله أعلم. جزاكم الله خير سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.